Okay, I think we're going to get started. My name is Jonathan Kimmelman. I am the director of the Biomedical Ethics Unit, which is a small but impactful group of scholars that's based up on Peel Street or in the medical school. And I want to welcome all of you for coming here. I'm so glad you could join us. So today's topic, Science and Skepticism, Critiquing Bad Research in an Anti-Science Era. This is a topic that is very near and dear to me. At first glance, it might seem a strange connection with research ethics, with bioethics, what I primarily do. But we're always faced with this dilemma when we do research ethics, when we look at the ethics of experimenting on human beings. On the one hand, we're really, really strong advocates of science. We're strong advocates of wanting to see policy decisions made on the basis of high-quality evidence. And we're often dismayed at the quality of the research that's done in the name of science with human subjects, and often wanting to advocate for better transparency, better research methods, et cetera. So on the one hand, we want to be critiquing science, encouraging it to strive to be better, while on the other hand, we also don't want to be emboldening critics of science, climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, et cetera, in trying to level critiques at sciences. So there are a lot of really interesting ethical questions at the interface between biomedicine, meta-research, and ethics. And really what the symposium is about is trying to sort of unpack some of those issues. So we've assembled an amazing group of speakers. I can't believe we were able to get as crackerjack a team of speakers here on the same date. It's amazing. These are some of my idols in this area, and I'm really grateful to them for braving the Montreal winters to come out here. I'm grateful for all of you for being present for the symposium. I'm really pleased to see this kind of interest and enthusiasm. I want to also thank Elena Bernier, who has helped with organizing this, our administrative assistant in biomedical ethics. A lot of preparation and groundwork necessary to pull this thing off. So thank you, Elena. And then finally, I also want to thank our funders. We've been really fortunate to have support of two major entities for the symposium. The first is the Class of 70, a gift of the Class of 70, which has through the years supported various kinds of bioethics lectures. So I'm very, very grateful to that graduating class of 1970 for making this possible. As well, we have received substantial contributions from the Epidemiology, Biostatistics, Occupational Health Department. So we're grateful to them as well for supporting this. I'm going to hand over the podium in 1 second to David Eidelman, who I'm also, by the way, very grateful that he could join us to introduce and be present for the beginning part of the symposium. But I want to say one thing really quickly, which is that this entire event is going to be videoed. So just be mindful that if you are asking questions during the question and answer period, you will be captured on film. So thank you. David?
Thank you very much, John. So as many of you know, my name is David Eidelman. I'm the Vice Principal Health Affairs and Dean of Medicine. And as many of you know, one of my duties as dean is to do the benediction at the beginning of meetings and say how great it is to have everybody here. And in this case, it really is great, and I've been able to put aside some time to participate, or at least to attend this symposium. I want to very much thank our speakers, Stephen Goodman, Richard Harris, and Philippe Raveau, who've come here from fairly far away to join us today. And you'll be hearing more about them as we go along. So as Jonathan said, today's symposium really touches on a topic which is of great interest. And I look around the room and I can see that we've attracted people from very diverse backgrounds, everything from neuroinformatics to medicine to epidemiology. We have Dr. Schwartz in the back there who's taking careful notes to make sure that we're appropriately skeptical. And this is as it should be, because there's an increasing focus in our faculty, at least, and I think in universities in general, on trying to grapple with this issue of what does it mean to do good science and what does it mean when you talk about bad science, and how to make sure that you police things in the right way without stifling academic freedom and without encouraging people to do things that we don't want them, that none of us would like to have done. So as a dean, this is very close to my heart. When things go wrong, I inevitably hear about it and it lands on my desk. I can see we have my colleague who is a former dean and former research integrity officer who has lived this in every form. We're really grateful to Jonathan Kimmelman and Nick King for who are themselves excellent researchers and scientists who study science and really trying to understand meta-science. We're very grateful to them to having had the idea to put together today's symposium and allowing us to engage in this really important conversation. So now, without further ado, I'm going to invite Nick King, who is associate professor here at McGill. He studies public health policy, ethics, and epistemology, and he holds a PhD in the history of science and a master's degree in medical anthropology from Harvard. And without further ado, Nick, thank you very much.
So I promise this is the last introduction before we get to all the speakers. As Dean Eidelman mentioned, I'm the co-organizer of this event, and I just wanted to do a couple things, which was give you some background on why we're doing this, and also introduce the speakers and the panel. So the idea for this symposium actually sprang out of a course that I've been teaching to fourth-year medical students for about the past 8 to 10 years that's called The Crisis in Health Research and Its Implications for Research, Health Policy, and Clinical Practice. The course covers what I've come to think of as the science is broken narrative. And here you see some recent articles and cover stories from the popular press on apparently how science is broken in myriad different ways. You can see a picture of one of our distinguished panelists down in the lower left corner there as well. And during the course, we basically review a sort of continuum of problems with scientific research, most of which I imagine you are at least familiar with to a certain extent, even if you're not experts in it, along a continuum that links poor research design, error, misconduct, and fraud. And this is a flowchart from a not-so-recent issue of The Lancet that sort of goes through all the different problems there are in science, from intentional fraud down to error and poor design in the methodology or analytic techniques that are used in scientific research. These issues include things like fabrication and falsification of data. So during the past 10 years, there's been research coming out that's shown that the number of retractions in major medical journals and scientific journals is on the rise. This is probably some combination of better understanding and identification of falsification and fabricated data, but there may be other issues at play. There's a lot of work that's come out, much of it inspired by John Ioannidis' sort of seminal article, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, about some of the perversive incentives in the publishing industry that surround things like p-hacking and the culture of null hypothesis significance testing. You may also be aware of what has come to be called the replication crisis, the vast amount of research that is either difficult or impossible to replicate or reproduce, and efforts underway to try to reproduce major findings. But also the persistence of discredited scientific ideas. This is what the researchers Adam Sifu and Vinoy Prasad have called medical reversal, when interventions that have been conducted for a long time are found through replication to actually not be effective, and yet they are still used in practice. And finally, the pernicious influence of sponsorship bias and conflicts of interest, many of which are actually rarely, if ever, disclosed. This is from a recent story that just came out over the weekend where the New York Times uncovered evidence that actually under the Obama administration, officials at the National Institutes of Health essentially solicited support from the alcoholic beverage industry to support large clinical trials that would demonstrate that moderate drinking of alcohol was actually beneficial to health, despite the fact that they were expressly prohibited from doing so. And this was only found through Freedom of Information Acts. It was never sort of disclosed publicly. My purpose with this course is and always has been to instill a kind of judicious skepticism in budding young health professionals towards inflated claims in the scientific literature, but also the popular press. This is, you may not be able to see this actually, this is a Guardian cartoon on how if you read the popular press, everything gives you cancer, and literally just about everything gives you cancer, including democracy, clams, mustard gas, and alcohol. No, really, alcohol, you heard me, alcohol, but maybe it doesn't. I like to use an agricultural metaphor, which I owe to my colleague Sam Harper, who's sitting in the audience right here, that we often tend to focus on bad apples. We individualize problems in science, believing that they stem from these bad apples, the fabricators, the falsifiers, the p-hackers, and corrupt scientists, and that improving science consists in plucking these bad apples from the tree. But in fact, for every bad apple, somewhere there's a bad incentive. And there are much more deeper systemic problems. There is, in some ways, a bad orchard. So why would people fabricate and falsify data? Well, many researchers have profound incentives to increase the number of publications, to publish or perish, and to be highly cited. Why might people p-hack or suppress data or engage in other statistical malfeasance? Well, publishers, both popular and scientific, have incentives to produce novel, surprising, or popular findings and not to publish null findings or replications. And I think obviously what drives conflict of interest, well, is individual incentives to make money. Medical students are often insulated from the ideas self-correcting enterprise and is unstable. So by the end of the course, almost inevitably, at least one student will say something like, you know, Dr. King, you have totally ruined us. I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm totally skeptical of everything, and you've made my life miserable. To which I reply with some version of the Dickens quote, that while things may seem bad, they're actually better than ever before. Why? Because of transparency. Because we're finally shedding light on problems that have been in the dark for too long, and that the first step to improvement is transparency. Rather than seeing absolute certainty in any single piece of scientific evidence, we should understand how to learn and to live with the uncertainty at the heart of the scientific enterprise. It's a hard lesson to teach, but teaching a new generation of health professionals how to be skeptical is probably my proudest professional achievement. But lately, my confidence in this mission has been shaken to a certain extent by the growing prevalence and influence of a different kind of skepticism, what some people call pseudo-skepticism or motivated skepticism, which seeks to undermine rather than improve the scientific enterprise, manufacturing uncertainty in service of preconceived ideology or self-interest. Obviously, the ascendance of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States and his administration's sort of cavalier attitude towards the truth has played a large role, and this is from the Time magazine cover immediately after the election of Trump. But we've known about these so-called merchants of doubt for a much longer time. Seemingly not a day goes by without another expose of some actor, energy companies, the tobacco or alcohol industries, the sugar industry, sowing uncertainty and bias within science. These exposés are good, they're necessary, and I cover them in my course. And they're instrumental in promoting a pragmatic skepticism of the scientific literature. But increasingly, I'm wondering, how do we square these exposés with the more pernicious kind of skepticism that infects the highest corridors of power? How do we square it with the fact that the Trump administration is well known for its disdain of scientific expertise and its open embrace of the idea that science is so broken we should not trust it for anything, even our own policy matters? It's also a symptom of a wider cultural phenomenon. Of course, in Canada, we actually have been well aware of the influence of a federal government that might have a dim view of the scientific enterprise. Which leads me finally to the question that for me sort of animates and frames this event. It's a question motivated by the observation that maybe skepticism can be self-defeating. For every skeptical action, every expose of a bad actor, there may be an equal and opposite reaction. So anytime we point to the undue influence of the pharmaceutical industry, perhaps these same arguments are taken up by, as Jonathan alluded to, vaccine deniers or vaccine skeptics who say, look what the scientists themselves are saying about the brokenness of science. We can't trust any pharmaceutical product. We can't trust any scientist at all. How do we account for this fact that vaccine skeptics and climate change deniers and other critics of the legitimacy of the scientific enterprise capitalize on the same kind of critiques? So for me, the big question moving forward is, how do we practice judicious skepticism in the service of improving understanding in an era rife with motivated skepticism in the service of undermining that understanding? We're very fortunate to have an incredibly impressive roster of speakers who are going to answer this question, wrap it up by 4 p.m., and then we'll be able to go out in the world and solve all the world's problems. And I'm going to move on to introduce them and also introduce you to the format. We are going to have each of our 3 primary speakers give a roughly 15-minute presentation, one after the other. Then we will have a 10-minute coffee break, so you can get up and stretch your legs. We'll have coffee in the adjoining room. We'll come back and we will have 2 brief comments from our distinguished panelists, and then we'll have open discussion. So we'd like to ask that you hold your questions until the second half of the event, when we will have open discussion and questions. So on to our speakers. Our first speaker is Steve Goodman. He's the Associate Dean of Clinical and Translational Research and Professor of Medicine and of Health Research and Policy, directing Stanford's CTSA Spectrum Training Program. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, which is sort of the epicenter of the meta research movement. It's a group dedicated to examining and improving the reproducibility and efficiency of biomedical research. Most importantly, so I've been told, his side gig is performing the national anthem at major professional sporting events like the San Francisco Giants and the Baltimore Orioles and Golden State Warriors. Steve, if you want to add anything, did I miss anything there? Okay.
Rigoletto, yeah.
And Rigoletto as well, for a change. Our second speaker will be Richard Harris, who, as he mentioned to me, has been at NPR forever and covered everything. And by looking at his online bio, apparently has been everywhere in the world, from Mount Kilimanjaro to tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific. He's been at NPR, National Public Radio, in the US since 1986. For a number of years, he studied climate change and climate change science, and more recently has turned towards covering biomedical research, and in particular has just written a book called Rigor Mortis: How Sloppy Science Creates Worthless Cures, Crushes Hope, and Wastes Billions. Our third speaker will be Philippe Raveau, who's a professor of epidemiology at Paris Descartes University and adjunct professor at Columbia University. He has a very long list of impressive achievements. He's the director of the INSERM Paris Descartes Epidemiology and Biostatistics Research Center, head of the Center of Clinical Epidemiology at the Hôtel Dieu University Hospital, and director of the French Cochrane Collaboration. We also have 2 very distinguished local panelists, Dr. Jennifer Fishman, who's an associate professor in the Social Studies of Medicine Department and Biomedical Ethics at McGill University. She studies and analyzes the unexamined assumptions, values, and ethical frameworks embedded in new biomedical and scientific enterprises. And her work has been published in venues including the CMAJ, PLOS1, and the Hastings Center Report. And last but not least, Dr. Corinne Riddell, a recent graduate of McGill's Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health, and a current postdoctoral fellow at McGill, where she's most interested in studying inequalities in infant mortality, homicide, and suicide between Black and white Americans. She is also a certified wizard at R programming and data visualization. Anyway, that's all for the introductions. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to our speakers. And first up, we have Steve Goodman.